Okay. So by request, I am recording this presentation on my dissertation work from Pacifica Graduate Institute. I've added a little bit more and expanded it to at least give a little bit more time to unpack some of what's in here. It gets kind of jargony. I'm drawing from specialized discourses here through much of it. So I'm just going to leap right in. So the title of my dissertation was Communal Reverie, toward a formulation of imaginal aperspectivity and the integral participatory imagination. Now, central to my work was Jean Gebser. Right? Jean Gebser was a poet. He was a mystic. He was a cultural philosopher writing through the 20th century. And his vision of the unfolding of consciousness kind of created the fundamental framework through which I was thinking about this practice of communal reverie, these collective experiences of the imaginal and the potentials and possibilities that affords. So while Gebser was living in Malaga, Spain, this was in the winter of 1932 to 33, he experienced what he later described as a flash of lightning-like inspiration. And through this inceptual flash, he intuited a fundamental transformation of consciousness underway in modern civilization, a transition toward what he called later an aperspectival or integral consciousness. Gebser considered our time to be a Janus-faced era, or what contemporary writer Zak Stein calls a time between worlds, where our presently dominant mental rational structure of consciousness and its corresponding civilization are breaking down. This is starkly evident today through the interlocking crises, ecological, socio-political, epistemic, and more that are besetting us today. This is what many contemporary thinkers are calling the meta-crisis. Yet for Gebser, dissolution also contains a solution. He writes in The Ever-Present Origin, if we do not overcome the crisis, it will overcome us, and only someone who has overcome himself is truly able to overcome. Either we will be disintegrated and dispersed, or we must resolve and effect integrality. Don't be fooled by this background image, however, for simply seeing one face looking backward toward the left and another looking forward to the future on the right would be a concession to our current consciousness structure. For Gebser, if we are to look forward, then there is a crucial sense in which we must leap backward, an embrace of our archaic inheritance exemplified in the magic and mythic structures of consciousness, integrating their different orientations to time, space, selfhood, and causality, as well as their attunement to subtler dimensions of existence with which most of us today have fallen out of consistent contact. For Gebser, the dawning integral structure of consciousness entails a rendering transparent of these latent structures, a condition he called diaphaneity, which he described as the form of manifestation or epiphany of the spiritual. Through the cracks appearing amid the upheavals of our current world structure, these deeper currents erupt again onto the scene, urging integration. Gebser's vision coincides with speculations that we are presently amid a second axial age, a historical turning point of comparable significance to that which gave rise to the presently dominant mental structure of consciousness, where an intensified sense of human individuality emerged, in correlation with an intuition of a transcendent absolute, as variously expressed through the birth of philosophy and the major world religions. A second axial age would necessitate a reincorporation of what has largely been left behind, requiring that the fruits of the first axial insight into a transcendent dimension of existence be brought back down to earth. As theologian Ewart Cousins stated, having developed self-reflective, analytical, critical consciousness in the first axial period, we must now, while retaining these values, reappropriate and integrate into that consciousness the collective and cosmic dimensions of consciousness. So Rilke, in whom Gebser felt he first discerned what he described as a personal breakthrough into a new disposition, where he first kind of intimated this integral consciousness, particularly in Gebser's encounters with Rilke's major poems, the sonnets to Orpheus and the Duino Elegies. Rilke writes in a famous letter, "In a purely earthly, deeply earthly, blissfully earthly consciousness, we must introduce what is here seen and touched into the widest orbit, not into a beyond whose shadow darkens the earth, but into a whole, into the whole." Right now, this has a lot of resonance with the way that Gebser is describing qualities of this integral consciousness. The undivided, ego-free person who no longer sees parts but realizes the itself, the spiritual form of being of man in the world, perceives the whole, the diaphaneity present before all origin, which suffuses everything. For him, there is no longer heaven or hell, this world or the other, ego or world, immanence or transcendence. Rather, beyond the magic unity, the mythical complementarity, the mental division and synthesis is the perceptible whole. So this is gesturing toward this new modality that is a new mode of perception, right? He's suggesting that the magic structure of consciousness sees a unity. The mythic structure sees things in terms of complementary opposites that are inseparable. You can think of the Tai Chi or yin yang symbol. And that the mental structure sees things in terms of duality and experiences things in terms of dualities that need to be reconciled. This integral consciousness structure somehow is beyond all of that into a wider wholeness. The integral consciousness is therefore not merely a summation of present with the past. It also incorporates the presence of the future, which for Gebser also influences the present. The integral consciousness thus entails a dramatic restructuring of our relationship to time, a condition Gebser called time freedom, or the achronon. Amid the increasing speed and tumult of our era, time breaks forth as an anxiety-inducing factor and active intensity, also urging integration. Gebser described a breaking forth of time, where time actually begins to disturb our mental rational consciousness and the world we've structured around it. He partly traces this to the invention of the steam engine, where the rhythm of machinic motoricity affects the technological alteration of our world. Both Donna Haraway and Timothy Morton have suggested the invention of the steam engine as the beginning of the Anthropocene epoch, since this is where human technology began to measurably alter the lithosphere. Consider the temporal pressure and urgency of our era. We're increasingly aware of a daunting meshwork of crises, and yet we seem unable to solve them in a timely fashion. Too much inertia to avert climate chaos, too much momentum to arrest the AI arms race. Our devices, once envisioned as a means of making our lives easier and more convenient, currently capture our attention by design, saturating us with more information, connections, and opportunities than we can readily metabolize, for better and worse. Flooded with the everything all at onceness of the world's teeming presence, we appear to be thrust into a moment of planetary initiation. While we may readily acknowledge a pervasive sense of crisis, we may also begin to intuit that the typical stance of identifying problems and setting out to fix them is not fully adequate to the situation before us. The proposition of consciousness mutation implies that the kind of mind that has generated our contemporary crises will not be the kind of mind that participates in their resolution. Gebser challenges us to consider that the symptoms of our crisis reflect our inability to relate with time, which he describes as an aspect of the element of intensity which constitutes the world. He held that the necessary transformations of our civilization require that our very understanding and experience of time, space, and causality, what Benito Roy calls metaphysical primes, must themselves undergo a mutation. This most fundamentally requires that we become radically present. The aperspectival consciousness therefore entails the concretion of time, which for Gebser is inseparable from the concretion of the spiritual. realized in what he described as the coalescence of the spiritual with our consciousness. And this further entails a new relation to the creative influences of the originating source, more primordial than time itself, after which Gebser titled his great work, The Ever-Present Origin. Origin in the original German is Ursprung, which means something like primordial leap. Gebser later discerned a marked convergence between his articulation of a dawning aperspectival consciousness and the evolutionary visions set forth by philosophers Sri Aurobindo and Teilhard de Chardin. Aurobindo also utilized the term integral in connection with his insights, which Gebser ultimately regarded as springing from the same source, expressing the common influence of an invisible origin. Just following the advent of COVID lockdowns in the spring of 2020, I was reintroduced to Gebser through an encounter with the work of Jeremy Johnson. Jeremy rightly describes Gebser's work as catalytic reading. Soon after, I experienced my own unexpected lightning flash of inspiration, seemingly in profound connection with the spirit of Gebser's work. Partly under the influence of discourse about collective intelligence that was brimming during that time, I intuited the possibility of a small group practice. Somehow the group would enable a deeper mode of sensing, a deeper way of knowing. In the aftermath of this inceptual flash, it was hard to resist doubting the idea that shined through during this uncanny moment of inspiration, judging it as a preposterous fantasy. And yet, a fire was ignited. Some months later, I encountered the notion of we-space, a term designating emerging modalities of group practices. A general orienting theme involves the claim that applying a certain clarity of intention and attention within group spaces can open up access to varieties of transpersonal experience, affording contact with deeper currents of collective intelligence and collective wisdom, which may aid us in responding to the mounting challenges our world faces. My way into doing we-space practice was through my encounter with Ria Baeck's work and collective presencing in 2020. And Ria writes in her book on collective presencing, the practice that we came to call collective presencing seems to tell us something about evolution itself, about a human capacity beginning to emerge, and about the new paradigm that we see and feel unfolding through us. The framework I found that best fit our experiences was Jean Gebser's description of the mutation of consciousness written halfway through the previous century. So upon reading that, I felt, in encountering Gebser again, I felt like I found a corroborator of that wild idea that came forward, and it gave me more confidence to step forward with it or continue pursuing it. So collective presencing rests on a practice that Ria calls sourcing, and sourcing has a couple dimensions to it. I'll start with it. It draws on something that she refers to as the group field, and she writes, here we use the notion group field to denote the inner dimension that seems to be present in any kind of group to which our Western world pays scant attention. There are always subtle energies present that we can learn to detect, to trust, amplify, and nurture. And ultimately, the group field is connected with the detection of potential. In order to be able to listen to the future, to the unmanifest that is knocking on our door, we need a deep inner stillness. This inner centering allows us to become aware of the subtle energies that point to more potential and its possible manifestation. A group connecting in silence, reaching out or opening up to subtle collective wisdom. So the early phase of collective presencing rests on something that Ria calls the circle of presence. She writes, in a circle of presence, the focus is on how to become present, increasingly so and in ever more settings and situations, so that an emergent collective wisdom becomes available. But what this ultimately is geared toward is something that she calls the circle of creation. In a circle of creation, the purpose is to extend the alignment in all directions and reach a space of shared creativity and generativity that adds more to life than what is already present, adds more. And when she speaks of extending alignment, alignment with that potential that we can sense through this practice of sourcing and subtle sensing. But the leap into the circle of creation isn't really a trivial matter. The difference is not superficial. Indeed, there is a chasm to cross. To transition from a circle of presence to a circle of creation is to make the very paradigm shift that is currently embroiling humanity at this time. So there's a suggestion here that if we've achieved the circle of creation, we have in some sense really achieved this integral mutation. And again, remember Gebser, it is our task right now to resolve and effect integrality. So this brings me to just to introduce communal reverie. Communal reverie may be described as a collective practice that brings together and interanimates various elements drawn from collective presencing and imaginal practices. For example, active imagination, soul-making dharma, embodied imagination. These practices aid us in reconnecting with the latent capacities that are always at work within us, though usually occluded by the activity of our waking mind. So if you put your Gebser goggles on here, it's reconnecting with the latent mythic and magic structures that are normally occluded by our mental rational consciousness. I'm first going to go a little bit further into the imaginal. In approaching the task of reflecting on communal reverie theoretically, I principally drew on three traditions engaging with the nature and potentials of the imagination in depth. First, Henry Corbin's work on the imaginal, right? And this term imaginal, as it's spreading through the culture, is largely attributable to Corbin's influence. Corbin draws from the Persian Neoplatonic traditions, most powerfully exemplified in the great Sufi mystics Ibn Arabi and Suhrawardi. And the basic idea here is that the imaginal is the place where we can connect with our own archetypal source and origin for our individual personality in a way that awakens an eros that is onward leading and helps us actually unfold into becoming in the likeness of our archetypal origin. I also drew on the Romantic philosophical tradition, most notably Goethe, Schelling, and Coleridge, and what can be described as their spiritual organic conception of the imagination as a natural creative potency. So this is the idea that the animating forces of nature itself that arise in evolution, that arise in life, in development, in the intelligibility of the world, that there's a continuity between what's animating nature and what's animating imagination. And therefore, the imagination actually becomes an organ of helping us connect with the energies of life, both as they express themselves in nature and as they express themselves through us. And finally, Jung's approach to active imagination, rooted in his analytical psychology with its understanding of the structure and dynamics of the psyche and its approach to understanding the relations between the ego and the unconscious. So for Jung, the imaginal is really understood in terms of the process of individuation, which first kind of entails ongoing integration of personality, meaning we have that portion of our own soul of which we're conscious and much of which we're unconscious. The imaginal helps us first integrate and incorporate and expand our personality to include more of our wholeness, but then that ultimately leads to a process whereby we exist in dialogue in a kind of back and forth relationship through dreams, through the imagination, with the transpersonal ground of our own being, our transpersonal source, in a way that is also onward leading and helps us kind of navigate our unfolding within a field of meaning, an anima mundi, a world soul. So amid their notable differences, these traditions share a fundamental concern with the symbolic union of opposites, exemplified in the coincidentia oppositorum. This is the symbolic union of opposing principles. Each in their own way posit an advanced realization of the coincidentia oppositorum through the reconciliation of the individuated ego with the ground and source of its being or its origin. And this culminates in a participatory relationship between the ego and the creative potency of origin, in which imagination plays a crucial role, right? So with these traditions and this aspect of them, of this kind of differentiation of the ego and the reintegration of the ego with its own source and origin, I can read Gebser's description of the mutation of integral consciousness in the same light. Now, there are some other converging views here. I'm going to back up here a little bit, though. So a lot of these perspectives have some relationship with and influence by the Romantic philosophical tradition. And I would say that the Romantic tradition was that tradition following the kind of intensification of what Gebser calls the deficient mental rational consciousness, and largely through the kind of Enlightenment tradition, which is an important tradition, and like very, very important things came online there. A lot of power came online there, but also this intensification of the kind of dualistic conception of consciousness and world, of human and nature, of mind and matter, which we're still kind of in the we're still under the sway of that in today's culture, and we're still kind of healing that rupture. The Romantics were the ones who kind of went through that prism as well. They became modern individuals, but had this sense of having been alienated from or ruptured with continuity with nature, and really looked at the imagination as an essential part of kind of healing that rupture. Now, Goethe's work on observing plant metamorphosis was extremely influential in this tradition, right? And Goethe discerned these movements that he called polarity and intensification. Right now, Goethe's gentle empiricism, as he called it, is a matter of observing the growth of natural forms, but in such a way that it's really looking beneath the surface of what's happening and also trying to sympathetically use imagination in a sympathetic way, such that the inner life of what's moving in the movements of life and the movements of organic growth can also be discerned. And there's an idea that because the imagination is grounded in the same source that life is grounded in, we actually have the capacity for that sympathetic resonance, right, with what we're observing. And so for Goethe, this notion of polarity is this idea that in the process of plant metamorphosis, when a new element of the plant is beginning to emerge, say the budding of a flower, right? You have stem, leaf, flower coming. There's initially a separative striving. You can see the new growth is actually kind of differentiating itself. It's the energy is moving out into a kind of separation. However, this act of polarity is a prelude to what he calls intensification, where the energy that was once separatively striving now exemplifies a kind of movement back inward, a movement of reintegration with the ground out of which it emerged, or its source, right? And once that is achieved, there's a new whole that kind of comes into being, but it's more differentiated and it's more complex than what was initially evident. Now, the Romantics largely conceived of this dualistic consciousness as a moment of polarity, preceding a moment of intensification, which is to say that that movement that Goethe discerned in plant metamorphosis is, in some sense, going through its own kind of expression in consciousness within the modern mind right now. So Coleridge described it this way, that there's a tendency in cosmogenesis itself, in the unfolding of nature. It shows the tendency at once to individuate and to connect, or to detach, but so as either to retain or reproduce attachment, right? So the integral mutation of consciousness is, one way of maybe describing this moment of intensification, this moment where we reproduce attachment or just reveal the retention of attachment to our ground and origin that's always been there but occluded. Now, there are a number of convergent visions and I'm just going to name 4 here, but there are others. But I'll say Jerome Bernstein has this notion, and he's a Jungian analyst. He has a notion of what he calls transrational consciousness. And he describes this as a borderland consciousness, where some individuals in contemporary culture are starting to demonstrate this openness to transpersonal modes of experience in such a way that because the modern culture doesn't have a framework for it, they actually get misdiagnosed, in his view, with psychosis. But he's seeing this as the first emergences in our culture of a kind of reconnection with nature and a spiritual dimension, whereby the modern mind is preparing itself to become a co-evolutionary partner with nature. Gloria Anzaldúa, like Bernstein, uses this language of the borderland, and she talks about la conciencia de la mestiza, or what she's calling a mestiza consciousness, which is also transrational, in that, you know, what's being described as the meaning crisis and all of these incompatible frames and worldviews. She's saying that, you know, we're kind of in this alchemical pressure right now, and the resolution actually isn't to find some meta-rational framework that can create a kind of rationally coherent view that integrates all of them, but that there's a whole making here that's actually being achieved by what is presently unconscious in us. So we don't go toward rational resolution. We actually deepen into the intensities of the natural processes unfolding and kind of be in this ambiguous situation. But there is something that's making the wholeness, but it's much deeper, and it exceeds what can be rationally understood. And she also really highlights the way that this alchemical cauldron is also going to be it's going to necessitate a metabolization of a lot of the collective trauma in humanity through all these separations and fractures and othering and difference, and the way that that there's a lot of trauma around that in her view needs to be metabolized. Okay. Richard Harness, in the epilogue to his book Passion of the Western Mind, talks about what he calls a mature participation mystique. And for him, this looks at the birth of the modern consciousness and the emergence of the Western mind, not as purely a deviation from connection with nature or embeddedness in the whole, but similarly as a kind of differentiation from the modern mind kind of differentiates from the matrix of its own being, but then freely and consciously surrenders itself to a re-embrace of the ground of its own being. Owen Barfield similarly talks about final participation. He also draws on this notion of participation mystique. This is a term that comes from the French anthropologist Lucien Levy-Bruhl. But the way Barfield's framing it is that, you know, at one point, humanity was embedded in a mythopoetic and kind of archetypally saturated wholeness. And with the emergence of the modern mind, that attunement to the mythopoetic and archetypal dimension was rendered unconscious. Final participation is the kind of reconnection and ability to once again kind of perceive and be sensitive to that archetypal dimension of existence, but in such a way where there's a more conscious participation with that archetypal dimension. And I'll have a little bit more to say about Barfield shortly. So approaching the imaginal via Gebser's structures of consciousness. So Gebser, in the ever-present origin, really confines his definition of the imagination as being a feature of just the mythic structure of consciousness. Like when the mythopoetic mind came online, like that's the way Gebser's defining the imagination. But largely inspired by Coleridge, I moved into suggesting that each of Gebser's structures of consciousness entails a unique inflection or mode of imagination. So this is to say that the experience of and relationship to the imaginal undergoes changes from a human standpoint in different phases of the evolution of consciousness. The integration of the structures of consciousness with the emergence of the aperspectival mind, therefore, coincides with an integral mode of imagination. Now I'm going to go into the different modes of imagination here, which are just going to draw on a lot of the features of these structures of consciousness as Gebser articulates them. So we start with the magic imagination. So this has to do with the autonomy of the imaginal. The imaginal shows its own agency. We, from our ego standpoint, don't control it, right? So I called these pneumatic factors. Pneuma meaning wind and spirit. It's a kind of animating presence. These are impulses and ideas deeper than consciousness, right? So I gestured to Philemon here. So Philemon, in Jung's Red Book, when he's beginning to do active imagination, he was an imaginal figure that showed up to Jung. He's this old, white-haired, bearded man with kingfisher wings and bull horns. And at one point, he tells Jung, "You think that everything in the imagination you created. You don't walk around out in the woods and think that the trees are there because you created them and the animals are there because you created them." Why? He's saying within the imagination, it's very much the same. These things have their own being, right? So with the magic imagination, we are connecting with things that come through the imaginal, but they have their own agency, they have their own otherness, their own autonomy, and actually they act through us. So when these autonomous factors act through us, we have these words. The ancient Greeks spoke of the daimon. Lorca, the poet, spoke of the duende, and Gloria Anzaldúa spoke of the naguala. And these is like creative inspiration, but it can also be a more destructive, compulsive activity. Jung would talk about archetypal possession. Often it can be some combination of both. The tortured artist who's extremely creative, but is also in the thrall of impulses that actually can have a destructive effect. But the point here is that there are things that move through us that are deeper than what we are generating with our conscious will. That's why Gebser's definition of magic is appropriate here. He calls it doing without consciousness, which means acting without egoic volition behind it. The magic imagination also entails an interfusion between humans and an enchanted world, meaning a world in which meaning is embedded in the world itself. So again, we'll come back to this notion of participation mystique, right? This is before maybe the emergence of a strong individuated sense of selfhood and being embedded in a cosmos that shows kind of purposes, meanings, intentions that aren't just experiences being kind of projected onto the world from a separate mind, but inhabit the world itself and being in the flow with those meanings and purposes. Jung's analogous notions here, he speaks of the psychoid, the unus mundus, and synchronicity, right? So the psychoid, it has to do with formulating archetypal patterns as not just being mental and not just being biological or even physical, but that in the world, symbols can express themselves largely in synchronistic events, right? Where there are these meaningful coincidences or a sense that the things that are going on in our interior consciousness and what's actually happening out in the world are resonating in a way that there's some kind of meaning that's tying it all together. And that we seem almost to be downstream of that meaning that the stuff that actually is informing our own subjectivity and seemingly constellating events in the outer world are gesturing back to something that seems to be prior to the seeming dualism, the seeming separation between mind and matter, or our subjectivity and the world out there. And Jung drew on this medieval term, the unus mundus, or the one world, to gesture toward a more fundamental ground from which this coordination, what we experience as an uncanny coordination, actually originates. And this goes into a kind of imaginal causality. I'll say more about that a bit later. And then there's Gebser's term of the vital nexus. And he links this with all of these ideas that are prior, but he also speaks of a kind of subtle energetic interfusion of the human being with the environmental surround, meaning that the human is energetically entangled with nature, with other beings. And this participation, right? This participation mystique has an energetic component to it. It's almost a subtle, you could call it a spiritual, energetic kind of entanglement. And in a lot of early cave drawings and depictions, you almost can see this energetic sensitivity being depicted. And finally, a more contemporary way of maybe giving some kind of account of some of these dimensions comes from the thought of Whitehead. So there's a kind of panpsychism or pan-experientialism here, which means that on some level, feeling and experience are actually like fundamental to the cosmos and go all the way down to some degree. And Whitehead has this idea of prehension, which is the sense that even at the most fundamental levels of the cosmos, like at the level of, say, atoms, or even deeper than that, there's this primordial proto-sensory feeling where everything actually takes in everything else. Everything is sensitive to everything else. It's this deep feeling transmission. So there's a sensitivity to the whole here that everything partakes in. And all of this, I'll say, are related to animism. So the magic imagination has this animistic kind of quality to it. And finally, the primary form of manifestation, as we experience the magic imagination, I would say somatic and subtle sensing are essential to that, right? So you have Eugene Gendlin's idea of the felt sense, right? That the body registers information in a way that's immediately felt, and it's often vastly overdetermined. There's all this information. There's like a kind of all at onceness to it in a way that is not usually easily translatable into conceptual knowing right away, but we just kind of feel it all at once and can tend to things on that level. Like our body knows so much more than our conscious mind does, right? So that's the felt sense. And then with Ria's work, right, there's also this notion of subtle sensing that goes out into that energetic body, right? That's entangled with everything else in this vital nexus, right? So we have this deeper knowing that actually extends out into the whole. So when we sense into the felt sense in both its more concrete somatic and subtle dimensions, the whole is somehow ingressed into us in a meaningful way. And we find ourselves woven into the whole. And so this connects with what John Heron calls feeling as resonance with being. When we tune into our feeling, we're resonating with everything. And John Heron also, drawing on the Whiteheadian language, says that the body rests on a great subconscious prehension of everything. So this is the magic imagination. It's where, in some ways, the imagination and like what comes up as like archetypal patterns are an expression of the world, of nature itself. Right, Carl Kareny said that in the symbol, the world itself is speaking. Right, so there's a deeper imagination that's actually the world or the cosmos is doing, and the magic and imagination is closest to that. Okay, so now we get to the mythic imagination. So it's first worth saying that the mythic and magic imaginations are very interspersed. It's hard to make a clean cut between them. They're kind of entangled. It's hard to know exactly where to draw the line. But what I'll say is the mythic imagination is characterized by the awakening to soul. And what is this? Well, it's the impersonal roots of personality. That there are particular ways of looking where there's a kind of narrative, there's a sense of self, other, and world that takes on a narrative structure that seems to often riff on archetypal patterns that we find in mythology. And so they're deeper than the ego and they're almost collective. Schelling would talk, and then many others, Gebser, Jung, would talk about myth as the dreams of a collective. Right. So in some ways, the myth is coming up as the collective's dream, and then all of the individuals and their experience of the world and the way it's being given a kind of narrative fantasy structure in which there's a kind of meaning to it is rooted actually in these collective dreams, and it riffs on them. We always find ourselves referred back to myths and find ourselves in resonance with myths, and they're more impersonal, they're collective. So it expresses itself in mythemes, metaphor, symbol. There's a mythopoetic narrative kind of quality that's coming through. So this is what Jung calls fantasy thinking, right? The texture of thought has a narrative mythopoetic dimension. Now, this also, the mythic imagination is where utopic space emerges. And I draw this from Corbin, and I'm going to use this multiple times. Utopic, it's from the Greek utopos, which means not place or no place. So this is the kind of virtual spatial extension that imagination has. When we drop into our imagination, it's a lot of times there's like an environment or there's a space that opens up, but it doesn't have concretely locatable, place like our experience of the physical world around us. It's like an inner world. It's like a virtual inner space that doesn't actually, it's like a place, but it doesn't have a place, right? So, there's I'll keep going, and I think I'm going to unpack this a bit more. So in this sense, I draw from Robert Bosnak here. It's quasi-sensory. And the philosopher of imagination, Ed Casey, speaks of meta-perceivable entities, because we can speak of the imagination with sensory terms, right? Like, I see this, I sense this, I smell this. But Casey wants to suggest that there's a sense in which we're making an overextended analogy with sense perception. Because yes, while we almost see things or we smell things, we're seeing things that aren't physically there. We're smelling things that aren't physically there, right? So we're not actually registering things through our sense doors, but we're having a quasi-sensory, a sensory-like experience of things that are meta-perceivable, meaning we're not actually perceiving them with our senses, but there's some kind of imaginal perception that's of a different order, right? And that brings us into that utopic space. And so Corbin would talk about images and suspense. There's a metaxy here. It's an in-between, which is to say that this sense of the mythic imagination seems to exist in between and mediate between our sensory experience of the world and the intelligible world of concepts or meanings or ideas or logos, right? When you have an image of something, it's more thought-like than an actual physical percept, right? It's more in the realm of thought, but it's more embodied, or in some ways more concrete than a purely abstract notion, because it's like you can see it, right? So but these things can be carriers of meaning, metaphor. You can feel a resonance between different metaphorical images and see that they carry meanings in a similar way, right? But also the meanings are more ambiguous than the clarity of conceptual thought. So this views the imagination then as a center point and a mediatrix, right? And Gebser did point out that the mythic imagination is symbolized by the coincidentia oppositorum, or the unity of opposites. The mythic imagination seems to play a mediating role. It's kind of in the middle. And thus it informs Coleridge's definition of the imagination. And this is one of my favorite of his definitions of the imagination. He speaks of it as the completing power which unites clearness with depth, the plenitude of sense with the comprehensibility of the understanding, right? So with this depth and plenitude of sense that he's describing, that's hearkening back to the mythic imagination, right? And the felt sense and the subtle sense, there's this plenitude, this all-at-onceness that connects us with the whole in a kind of pre-conceptual way. But this mythic imagination, and thus the imagination actually as a whole, really, unites this depth and plenitude with clearness and with the comprehensibility of the understanding, which means the clarity of conceptual thought, right? And so this gestures us, we now leap to the mental imagination. Mental. So this is imagination entrusted to what Jung called directed thinking, right? This is where we have a sense of having control over our thoughts, right? Agency. We choose to think certain things, right? And this can, of course, interact with the imagination, right? If I say, imagine a purple giraffe right now, you can probably imagine a purple giraffe, unless you have aphantasia, which is like a condition where you actually can't get inner images, which I don't understand very well. But so then this sense that if I can prompt you to imagine a purple giraffe and you can just do it, that leads to a notion that the imagination just fabricates things, that actually it just kind of creates things that aren't real, and we can totally delude ourselves, or it's kind of like a fun faculty where we can get away from reality, right? So it influences the mental imaginations where we can actually influence this utopic space, right? And we can be free of influence from the autonomy of the magic imagination, right? Where Philemon says, you don't create the things in the imagination, what he was asserting to Jung, which really influenced Jung's idea of the reality of the psyche. This is the other side of that, where we can have experiences of that virtually extended space that we are clearly creating, right? And we can think that that's all imagination is, right? So that course, Coleridge called this fancy, this capacity of the imagination to apply volition and choice and willfulness to just fabricate unreality, right? Corbin called this imaginary, and he actually introduced the term imaginal to draw a distinction and to say the imaginal, which means the imagination has more than just this imaginary quality. Now, I'm going to take this a step further, and there's a little bit of a leap here, but you could say also that the mental imagination includes thinking and abstraction, right? Coleridge would call these acts of the imagination that are one with the products of those acts. Now, Coleridge and Schelling looked at, imagine what we call imagination and thinking as existing on a continuum, right? So you have the way that the imagination begins to appear autonomously, these mythic images appear, or the way that magic autonomy of the imagination starts to show up. But then there's this point at which we can begin to direct that, right, and actually have influence over what gets created. And then at a further intensity, that just turns into our capacity for thinking and abstraction. But there's one energy that's in different moments of its own intensification, you could say. But we need to talk about abstraction then. So Schelling talked about what he called reflection, and Coleridge called this the negative understanding. It resonates with what Gebser called the deficient mental rational consciousness, and what Ian McGilchrist calls left hemispheric dominance. So Gebser spent a lot of time actually critiquing this deficient mental rational consciousness, saying that when we abstract, there's a sense in which abstraction can mean where we begin to create linguistic and conceptual representations of the actual things in the world that are kind of a step removed. There are ideas and labels for them, and then we can actually become more invested in those representations in such a way that we actually lose contact with the immediacy and particularity of the world in a way that dualistically alienates us from it, and that these abstractions, because they can be really powerful, but we can dwell in them in a way that we're disconnected from the whole and from context and from a sense of our connection with everything. When we act out the kind of power of these abstractions, we then begin to act in the world in a way that's extremely destructive. And this is when we kind of get lost in these distancing abstractions. Okay. However, there's a different sense of abstraction, and this is what Benito Roy calls pure abstractions. Coleridge would talk about this as reason with a capital R, and Ian McGilchrist will talk about right hemisphere priority. Now notice here there's not dominance, but there's priority, which means the right hemisphere would be the aspect of us that's actually in contact with the particular, that has more of an awareness of the whole, has an awareness of context, and thus when we actually engage in abstraction, we don't get lost in our abstractions, but we always embed them back in the immediacy of our experience and don't get away from concrete experience. Benito Roy will talk about pure abstractions, and she points to Christopher Alexander and his notion of the quality without a name. And so this is the idea that, there's a way that that abstraction can actually lead us into a direct perception of very deep patterns that are actually at work in the world. And so these are abstractions that actually connect us with deep principles of nature and lead us further into the world. Matt Siegel will talk about the etheric imagination in this sense, that imagination actually becomes a way that we can look beneath the surface of things and see the deeper principles at work. But we're kind of getting toward a more integral expression when we're actually getting toward this way of understanding abstractions. But it's important to note that there are these two different aspects of abstraction, and they both could be considered that this negative imagination could be kind of considered, or the negative understanding, as Coleridge puts it, could be the mental imagination where it disconnects itself from these deeper layers of imagination. Then there's this integral mode where this is actually brought back into integration with these different layers of the imagination. If that makes sense. Okay. So taking this view of the imagination, we would rightfully anticipate that a new inflection of the imagination will begin emerging as the integral structure of consciousness begins breaking forth. This inflection would braid together and incorporate features of the magic, mythic, and mental imaginations while also going beyond them. Given my choice to work with Gebser in my dissertation, I tentatively called this mode of imagination Imaginal Aperspectivity. I suggested that communal reverie practice appears as one context in which imaginal aperspectivity may begin to emerge in fleeting glimpses. Okay, so this brings us back to resonances with Barfield's notion of final participation, which he thought of as Romanticism come of age, like a maturation of it. And it rests on this notion. He draws in this image of the Aeolian harp, right? And this was a symbol that the Romantic poets used often to describe the experience of poetic inspiration. So the Aeolian harp is a harp that's just, it rests outdoors, and when the wind blows, its strings are caused to resonate and it begins to sound. So this idea, again, pneuma, right, a pneumatic factor. Barfield would often point to the words pneuma, ruach, spiritus, which all mean breath and wind and spirit, sometimes soul. Wordsworth, the Romantic poet, would talk about what he called Aeolian visitations, right? So when he would experience poetic inspiration, it would just come almost of its own autonomy, and he would be inspired, and suddenly it's like he could just get an intimation of a poem that was wanting to be born, and then he would have to kind of labor to help bring it into being, right? But we hear the traces of that kind of autonomous magic and imagination at work in these Aeolian visitations, but then there's also a sense that he had to come in and participate, right, to bring the poems into being. So one way that that Barfield talks about this final participation, it is rather as if a musical instrument which was being played on, an Aeolian harp perhaps played on by nature herself, fell silent for a while. And then, after an interval, when it began to sound again, it was no longer merely an instrument, but had become aware of itself as such, and could itself take part in the playing of itself, right? So we have a transition from a passive state of just letting the autonomy of nature express itself kind of through this harp, or you could say through the state of original participation, or these kind of deeper structures of consciousness. And then it falls silent for a while, right? So there's a loss of touch with the animating power of spirit and nature, but then it returns, but in such a way where now the harp is active in the playing of itself. So there's conscious participation, right? Final participation is the state where we become reconnected with the movements of spirit and nature expressing themselves through us, but we have more conscious participation in that expression. So I want to bring this into dialogue then with Gebser here. And this is a loose correspondence. It's not perfect, right? But I'll say through the interplay of the mental and magic imagination within the integral imagination, volition and surrender are reconciled in final participation, which means our own egoic agency is brought into, again, participation with a deeper agency, a deeper will that can move through us. We make ourselves available for the expression of a deeper will, but we participate with it, right? But also, through the interplay of the mental and mythic imagination, creation and discovery are reconciled in final participation. Right? A lot of times the imaginal is spoken as something where there's creation and discovery, or there's a mutuality between this, which is to say, the images that show up in the imagination, we're not just generating them like in fantasy, right? It's not like I want to imagine a purple giraffe and then you do it, right? Things show up with their own, there seems to be an otherness, there's an autonomy, there's something that's irreducible to our own egoic will. And at the same time, it's not like we don't participate in it. It's not like we have no hand in creating it, right? Actually, our participation is also somehow implicit. So there's, within this utopic, right, imaginal space, when we have images come up, it's something in between creation and discovery, irreducible to either one of those. Okay, so now I'm going to leap into discussing communal reverie practice then. Because initially there were 3 kinds of sessions. So this was the initial provisional structure. And communal reverie practice started toward the beginning of 2021. I reached out to Cristiano Siri and Cheryl Shu and let them know that I was intimating this, something that was going to be like a collective presencing practice, but it was going to emphasize image and the imagination. And we began to actually put this into practice, and it went for a little bit over a year, having kind of weekly meetings. And this is This, I don't think, is going to be the structure moving forward, but this is how it kind of took form in that original endeavor. So we had what were called lunar sessions. This is where the group begins by attuning to the body, practicing subtle sensing, and beginning to source imagery, right? Again, in this utopic mode of the mythic imagination, meaning that we just become available for images to arise in that imaginal space. And this is done in connection with the group field, right? So there's sensing and sourcing from the group field and allowing the imagery to come from there. We use a talking piece, and the practitioners speak the imagery that comes to them in turns. And in most cases, not all, but most, an imaginal space begins to unfold through a shared imaginal journey. So this is an image that Cheryl created after the first session that had the qualities of what we came to call the lunar session. And this was the kind of imaginal utopic space that we entered together, right? And Cheryl did this great illustration. It's there's this plateau. Atop the plateau are these fires, and there are groups kind of gathered around these fires, but there's this big gate, and the gate leads to this waterfall that plunges into this large body of water. Right? And I'll give a little account here. An elevated plateau appears, and upon it a great gate. She runs to the gate and boldly leaps, diving down a steep waterfall into a vast body of water below. The water is full of bubbles, and inside one of these bubbles, she recognizes the plateau and the gate above. She swims into it, thus returning to where she started. All about the plateau, groups of people gather around a collection of fires. She tries to tell them where she's been, of the water, of the countless other worlds and bubbles of which this is but one, but none believe her. Then we had solar sessions. And this proceeds as a collective presencing session. The group sources from the group field using the talking piece. Mythic imaginal attunement is neither emphasized nor discouraged, but free and open verbal exchange is encouraged. And the conceptual and discursive processes of mind, right, the more mental qualities, are welcomed. Ongoing sourcing, though, is the guideline. And then finally, we had what we came to call corridor sessions. And it was Christiana who first suggested this idea of the corridor. And it became kind of symbolized by the eclipse. This entailed a more fluid intermingling of the qualities of presence associated with the solar and lunar sessions. It typically coincided with a marked energetic intensification in the felt sense of the group field. Initially, these sessions seemed to stand out from lunar sessions, and in the beginning even seemed to correspond with our intentions to engage in a corridor session. Over time, the qualities associated with these sessions began to erupt more frequently, even in sessions designated lunar, and thus the idea of attributing the quality we came to call corridor to any particularly defined session fell away. And I'll go into the qualities that I'm referencing here. And these will be attributes of what I'm calling imaginal aperspectivity. So I'm going to describe this thing that was a little bit different in the imaginal attunement that seemed to burst forth first in connection with this idea of the corridor, but then it still kind of had that quality, but it became kind of unpredictable and had its own autonomy. So this brings us to going into imaginal aperspectivity. So there are several features here. And the first one I'm going to describe is, I'll just call it transsubjectivity. First thing I'll say is that this supersedes Henry Corbin's, what I'm describing as his imaginal privatism, okay? So Corbin strongly emphasized that the greatest potentials of the imaginal, which he conceived as theophany or divine revelation, right? The imaginal is a place where the divine can reveal itself to the individual. So it emerges in a private relationship between the individual and the divine. And Corbin really emphasized that that's necessary. Like theophany only happens between the individual. So this needs to be an individual endeavor. Your theophany is your theophany, and it has to do with your individuation, nobody else's, right? But here there's an opening of the possibility that through presencing, the group can become a locus of imaginal revelation. The term transsubjective comes from Otto Scharmer, and in his view, it links both it links the self to the collective, and it links the self to the capital S self. There's some resonance with the way Jung talked about capital S self. Sharma frames it as the presence, one's present state to one's highest future potential. So one's potential is there, but transsubjectivity, then there's a linking to the collective and our own future potential. So it brings this together with the collective. I would also connect this to what Thomas Scheininger and Elizabeth DeBold call trans-individuation. So it's this idea that that the individuation that's been achieved from the kind of mental structure of consciousness is now surpassing itself in a way that is not negating our individuatedness, our agency, our uniqueness of perspective, but is now beginning to weave our individuated sense into a creative potential that surpasses our individuation. We need to actually participate in a greater wholeness now, and our individuation is serving that greater collective creative potential. And so I would also link it with what Gebser calls the supersession of the ego. Gebser writes, "Is there another world in weight, accessible only through individuation and its supersession, just as individuation was brought about by surpassing the clan?" Right. So we have to differentiate from the we in order to become our own unique self. And I think what Corban describes is that there is some individual access that can't be bypassed in terms of our personal relationship to the imaginal, but that's not where it ends, right? That this transsubjective expression of the imaginal is actually now emerging as part of a deeper cosmological imperative. That this is part of cosmogenesis and the role of becoming an individual within a deeper evolutionary process. So whereas the drive toward individuation accompanied the first axial age, the impulse toward trans-individuation will accompany the second. And this is from Cynthia Bourgeault's book, The Eye of the Heart. She writes, "When we are working on a galactic scale, the heart that apprehends the revelation appropriate to our times is no longer the individual heart, but the noetic heart of the imaginal body of humankind, in which each fully prepared wisdom group holographically participates. To the extent that the conscious circle bears witness to that higher imaginal body and in fact arises as a specific expression of it, I believe that groups and wisdom schools are here to stay as the prime locus of conscious circle activity as we approach that second axial threshold." Now, the next quality I'm going to describe is called I call it the transloosing of the threshold of consciousness. And I introduced this term to draw a distinction from a term that Jung drew on quite a bit from the psychologist Pierre Genet. And it's always in French. He calls it abaissement du niveau mental. And it often gets translated as a lowering of the threshold of consciousness. You can also think of it as a lowering of the mental level. But the point here is that it implies that the mental structure of consciousness, right, or this directive thinking, what Jung called, and what he called fantasy thinking, or these mythic and magic kind of qualities of consciousness, they're presently construed as mental consciousness and magic and mythic unconsciousness, and that there's actually something like a mutually exclusive relationship between them, which is to say, if we're going to have our waking kind of conscious rational mind online, it's going to put those deeper structures in the background, right? And if we want to access those, we kind of have to go into a state, often it's described as between waking and sleep, or we have to dim our conscious activity in order to kind of quiet things down so that that background unconscious activity can shine through. Now, I'm reframing this mutually exclusive arrangement as a feature of the presently dominant mental rational consciousness, which means as long as this is the dominant consciousness, yes, to get in touch with these deeper things, we need to dim our wakeful mind. However, this is understood now to be superseded by what Gebser deems supra-wakefulness. And this means more, it's not like extremely awake, but it's more than awake. There's something that goes beyond just wakefulness. And the requisite condition of this would be diaphaneity, or that transparency, right? So that these deeper things can actually shine through and coexist with our waking rational minds. So the supra-wakeful state leading to a transloosing of the threshold of consciousness is supported by an energetic intensification in the group field. And this intensification arises with its own autonomy, emerging as a matter of grace. Right. So when this translucing of the threshold of consciousness happens, it's like when that corridor quality emerged, we can make ourselves available for it, but it has its own autonomy, or we can't, there's a mystery in how and why and where from it emerges. There's a quality of grace. Now I want to illustrate this a little bit. So this is how a translucing of the threshold of consciousness would work. Say you're tuning into the felt sense, the somatic, energetic, subtle felt sense, and you're just feeling into all of that kind of information, all of that wholeness, just that all at onceness. Even if it's vague, it's felt, it's not clear yet. And then as you're feeling into that, an image emerges, an image comes to you, right? And then an insight comes, right? Now, if you're kind of in your wakeful mind, then that that magic, kind of the plenitude of that felt sense and whatever the image is, those are going to kind of be dimmed down. You won't be able to access them unless you quiet down and go into that state and suspend your waking mind. And then the magic and mythic kind of qualities, you can be more present to those, but you got to be in a very relaxed mental state. And if you bring that online, those go back into the background again, right? That's what the abasement du niveau mental is saying, the lowering of the threshold of consciousness. Now, a translucing would be something, and this isn't perfect because really it's not so much like you're kind of dimming everything, but it's like everything becomes more intense, everything becomes brighter, more lucid, right? But you do have this sense that you can kind of see the magic, mythic, and mental dimensions, and they're all co-present, like they can all kind of hang out together. And it's notice it's symbolized by an eclipse. Like the first time I saw a perfect solar eclipse, Mercury and Venus and Mars were in the sky. And when that total eclipse happened, it's like the sun was still there and there was still this kind of like twilighty, but like midday kind of sky. And then these backgrounded stars also shined through. So it became a pretty apt symbol. Now, I want to connect this translucing of the threshold of consciousness with something that I've called synairetic imaginal attunement. And this word is drawing from Gebser. Gebser has this term synairesis, and this is the integral mode of perception that accompanies the aperspectival consciousness. It's derived from the Greek word synaireo, which means to synthesize and collect, notably in the sense of everything being seized or grasped on all sides, particularly by the mind and spirit. So it's the seeing from multiple vantage points, right? And you can think of every structure of consciousness and its kind of attunement as being a different vantage on a way of apprehending the wholeness, the whole. It expresses a gradually maturing equilibrium of magic, mythic, and mental orientations. Right? So let's, first, one really simple way of characterizing synairetic imaginal attunement is as an awareness of the mutually enriching interplay between felt sense, image, and concept. There are two possible modalities through which the mutually enriching interplay between these elements may arise. The first is through successive oscillation between them, but then the second, this is the one I'm kind of suggesting is possible, through the simultaneous conjunction between all of them. So I want to go back to this illustration. Now, let's say this is the oscillating, right? You tune into your felt sense, you're feeling what's there, and suddenly an image comes to you, and you're tuning, predominantly into the image, and then you feel back into the subtle sense, right? And then an insight kind of comes to you, and then you through that insight you return to the image and you see it differently through the lens of that kind of conceptual framework that you've contacted, and then that image actually feeds back into the idea, and a new insight springs in connection with the image, right? But then here's that more conjunctive sense, right, where everything's kind of hanging out and intermingling. So I wrote in the dissertation, dreamlike and quasi-sensory mythic imagery spontaneously grew increasingly interspersed with conceptual and theoretic reflections, which often appeared to spring directly from the images themselves. Logoi, or conceptual frameworks, ideas, seemed to flower organically from the soil of mythoi, or images, producing something akin to a self-generating interpretation, growing out of the images. So it's like the insight just kind of comes naturally, resulting in surprising emergences of insight. Both mythic imagery and conceptual insight, however, were enriched by continuous attention to the bodily felt sense, which anchors connection with the group field. Right. So this is me reflecting on at least my own experience during these moments that we came to describe as the corridor. What is crucial to note here is that this sort of diaphanous quality was generally accompanied by a state of energetic intensification in the group field, right? And this intensification is felt in the body. So this mysterious intensification happens in the field, the body's registering it, and that supports this kind of diaphanous and synairetic imaginal attunement. The co-present interplay between bodily felt sense, quasi-sensory imagery, and conceptual thought are experienced as an integration of different facets or registers within a more processual, holistic way of knowing. However, integrality and synairesis cannot be reduced to the interplay of these factors. As Gebser described it, synairitic process, which makes the integral structure, consciousness structure accessible, is a new capacity and not a mere sum of the old. Integrality springs forth with a distinct form of perception, shining through a deep and intensified field of presence, capable of presentiating time, which means it gathers time somehow, gathers the dispersal of time, and thus renders it concrete. We have a more extended and whole experience of time. This brings us to what I've called rhizoconicity, and I'll just define this term and elaborate it a bit more. What I'll say, so as communal reverie practice continued on a weekly basis for over a year, I began to notice instances where images from previous sessions would spontaneously reemerge in the context of later sessions. But this would always happen seemingly in meaningful resonance with the imagery presently being sourced, meaning we'd be tuning into images and then images from previous sessions would also kind of come to mind or be recalled in a way that seemed to have resonance with what was presently going on. This time-spanning resonance between images also seemed to be in resonance with the present state of the group field. So this invokes a discussion that James Hillman and Edward Casey had about Gaston Bachelard's notion of retentissement, he calls it, this French term. This attributes a quality of resonance to images. Images resonate with one another in mutual poetic sympathy. Right? And this gives rise to what the poet Baudelaire described as correspondences. So there's a metaphoric likeness, right? There's a similarity between images. They resonate with each other, and you can feel there's some kind of corresponding preconceptual meaning that ties them together. Oops. Beginning to note wherever this occurred, I eventually drew out a visual representation of the practice sessions from each week up to that point. And I drew a connecting line between two sessions wherever these poetic correspondences began to occur between images. And this ended up representing constellations of different moments in time connected through imaginal resonance. And so an entangled tapestry of time came into view. So this is going to be a depiction of what I drew out initially. And I just want to, recall these lunar, solar sessions and eclipse sessions. You're going to see the ordering of how that was structured. So here at the bottom left corner, then you see the first lunar session, which was the one that I showed Cheryl's depiction of and described. And you're going to see the movement between different lunar sessions and solar sessions, corridor sessions. So this is week by week here. Now, you can see at the top above there, that's the first corridor session. It's the first session that we call the corridor, and it's the first time when I noted this resonance between images, right, happening. And so it's fitting that the corridor session, which for me seemingly reaches toward the integral consciousness more explicitly, the time dimension broke in with this resonance, right? But as I said before, it's like the structure didn't quite hold up, and this integral quality would break through at other times. And you'll see the links continuing to proliferate. I'll say while this did happen regularly, there's different degrees of that intensity or transparency where this is happening. But that lunar session up in the upper right is the last one I recorded, and lots of resonance there. Right. And so you can see there's like this schematic. It's kind of abstract. I'm not doing this in the most concrete terms, but I want to illustrate something here. This entanglement between time and images through resonance, right? Resonant images gathering memory and gathering time. So this term rhizocon is taken from the Greek rhiza, which means root, and icon, which means likeness or limit image, right? So it's got the aesthetics of a kind of entangled, nonlinear wholeness, but it's made of, it's imaginal. Rhizoconic process entails an entanglement of time and images whereby disparate moments are drawn into mutual resonance via common archetypal patterns. Or alternatively, it can be imagined as a process whereby clusters of discrete moments are revealed as a dispersal of time events, refracted from a common point of origin and evincing an analogous kairos patterning. So this alternative framing, it's got a much more mystical bent to it. And I'll draw on a supporting quote here, but kairos, right? Kairos is the idea that there's a qualitative dimension to time, that almost different moments in time have a different kind of archetypal structure to them. And so this rhizoconic process, it's like different moments have a similar kairos. That's why the images are emerging and that's why they're resonating, but it's making the unfolding of time in different moments more concrete in their archetypal relationship, and thus a deeper ordering or a deeper wholeness underlying them. So I'm going to read a bit here from Cynthia Bourgeault's Eye of the Heart. Right? She writes, Teilhard de Chardin describes how we humans are typically trapped within our own horizontal field of perspective, looking at things objectively, so we think, but always and only at eye level. And this is really a gesture toward the mental rational consciousness and how it sees the world. The interior topography of consciousness, right? She talks about imaginal causality, is indeed linked to the higher vantage point, energetically and causally, from which things themselves radiate. This is so because, as we have seen, the imaginal is causative. The imaginal has an influence. It contains the epicentric point from which all things radiate outward into this slower sphere of causality. So what we experience as linear time might have a deeper arrangement from a different vantage point, right? And we might even say that this is closer to the mythic and magic structure of time that we have fallen out of touch with. And it begins to, when we get the sense of imaginal causality at work, we start to see through again into this mythic and magic or, ordering of time, which is more of a wholeness. It doesn't have that linear quality. To see from this point of view is indeed no longer merely subjective, but the subjective point of view coincides with the objective distribution of things. Right? So it's actually the way things are ordered in time is in some sense influenced or caused by a deeper influence. And we peer into that influence and begin to recognize it when we do imaginal practice or when we open to the imaginal. And it begins to shine through even more when imaginal practice begins to gather time for us and presentiate or render time concrete. That's Gebser's term, presentiation. But it's when the wholeness of time begins to become evident to us, we can actually begin to perceive it. So I'm going to give another supporting quote here, and this is Gebser on archetypes as originary elements. He writes, to the same extent that it is true of atomic and biological structures, the archetypical structures are not representable and inconceivable. They point to a rationally unrealizable state before time and space, and indeed before space timelessness. That is the case when the archetypical structures are regarded as symbolic manifestations of what lies before space timelessness. When they are so perceived, the achronon appears in them. Considering Gebser's statement about the originary or time-free character of archetypes, we might consider that imaginal practice constitutes a means of opening to a more deeply participatory relationship with the creative influences of origin as it richly echoes and reverberates through archetypal images and patterns. And this brings us to the last thing, the last feature that I'm going to describe. It's called concrescendence. And another new word, another new weird word, great. Why? Well, in this case, this term almost came up like of itself, like it almost had its own agency. So I just rolled with it. And there's multiple ways that the term is apt and kind of drives its meaning. So first, it's distinguished from the Sufi mystic Ibn Arabi's term, and Corban gave it this translation, condescendence, right? And this is from this Arabic term, munazala. So condescendence suggests that transcendent archetypal factors descend to the mortal realm for the sake, or they descend to the imaginal, where mortals can rise to meet them, but for the sake of leading mortals back to their transcendent and eternal origin. So there's a way that this is a step forward from the traditional axial conception, because rather than seeing the kind of transcendent and divine as totally separate from the immanent world and uninvolved, this actually says that no, the divine actually has an eros for the manifest realm, and comes down to meet us halfway, right? And there's an eros here that's leading us, just as there's an eros that leads us up to our archetypal origins, and then we mingle in the imaginal. But from a mortal standpoint, it's still for the sake of trying to get back to the transcendent and the eternal. And there's a kind of mystical yearning that's awakened here. But I think that's moving in the direction of what a second axial shift is calling for, but it doesn't quite go far enough. It's not the kind of theory constitutive metaphor that I think a second axial age is calling for. So concrescendence then, right? It contrasts condescendence, but it's also, it combines the terms concrescence, right? It's from the Latin concrescere, meaning to grow together. And this is a term that both Whitehead and Gebser use. And it combines it with also transcendence, right? It has the send kind of root word there, which means it means to climb. So rather than trying to climb up and beyond this world, there's a different way that we're climbing, or we're reaching beyond ourselves with concrescendence, and it's more embedded in this concrescence. I want to give an explanation of what Whitehead means by concrescence, because this is really important here. And it's hard to describe concisely, but I'll say, for Whitehead, what the cosmos is fundamentally, it's a nexus, or it's a field of drops of experience. I got that from my friend Matt Siegel, right? These drops of experience that, and I already brought in this idea of prehension, right? These drops of experience prehend each other. So it's to say the cosmos is made of centers of sentience. And these centers of sentience all take in each other from their own vantage point, right? And it's through this primordial feeling. So the cosmos is a dispersal of centers of sentience. They all feel each other, and as they take each other in, they also feel a lure toward potential, toward future potential. It gets registered to them. So they're not only feeling each other, they're feeling potential. And as they take all of that in every moment, based on the way that things presently are in the cosmos and the sense of potential, they respond to that sense of potential and that sense of each other by acting. They have agency, they have choice, and they add their answer to that sense of potential in relation to the constellation of all the relationships that they're embedded in. And this happens over and over again through every pulse of temporal duration. And as that happens, these centers of sentience sometimes feel potential that calls them into deeper modes of kind of creative self-organization, metastable or autopoetic self-organization, right? And as certain of these centers of sentience begin to create more and more complex wholes, there are deeper and more complex modes of experience that begin to emerge. And those deeper modes of experience that begin to emerge actually have more creative autonomy and creative agency. And there's a lot to go in here, but for Whitehead, this is how the entire cosmos as we know it emerges. And it first goes through what we think of as physics, right? And these are actually, for him, habits. There are ways that these centers of sentience have grown habitually kind of disposed to relate to each other in such a way that it seems like they're immutable laws that we measure and everything. But actually, this is on a continuum. And as these centers of sentience begin to correspond in more complex self-organizations, you have the emergence of what we think of as life, although you actually can't, it's hard to actually draw the line before that emerges. And then with life, we see it's less predictable. We can't actually boil it all down to kind of Newtonian laws anymore. That's why Kant said there will never be a Newton of the grass blade, right? With life, we can't boil it down to causal forces, the whole and the intelligibility of it. And you could think of it as like this resonance that these centers of sentience have with each other. And then eventually that gives rise to us, right? And so the idea is that our bodily substratum is actually rooted in these, Whitehead calls them actual occasions, these sentient centers, right? And we are still in a cosmos comprised of sentient centers that not only where everything is taken in and felt, but that potential is felt and registered, right? And then we can add our creative response to that, right? So this is really important for what's coming. And then Whitehead also talks about concrescence as, again, the coalescence of the spiritual with our consciousness. I can interpret that as having some important sympathy with what Gebser's talking about. So concrescence aims to reformulate the notion of transcendence inherited from the axial age, positing transcendence not as a separate and more highly valued realm, but rather transcendence in the self-transcendence entailed in creative action, through which unmanifest potential is realized, and the participatory interplay between visible beings and archetypal potencies, which are the contours of relevant potential, is the way I'll say it. And this means that the world needs to become sacred again. We find the sacred in the world and in the creative advance that we are participating in. Gebser writes, the new mutation of consciousness, as a consequence of irrationality, receives its decisive stamp from the manifest perceptual emergence of the spiritual. Two apocryphal statements of Christian doctrine clarify in their way what is meant here. The world is a bridge, cross it, but do not make of it your dwelling place, and I have chosen you before the earth began. They point to the spiritual origin prior to all spatiotemporal materialization. We may regard such materialization as a bridge that makes possible the merging or coalescence, the concrescere of origin and the present. Concretion, then, does not mean a transformation of the intangible into something tangible or substantial, but rather the completion of concrescere, that is, the coalescence of the spiritual with our consciousness. And further, Gebser writes, and this is important, there is today a change in man's creative relationship to the primordial energy which is pressing toward consciousness, a change with respect to creativity itself, which corresponds to the changing and mutating consciousness. So there's a new relationship to creativity, and that's a new relationship to origin. So I'm going to articulate to the best of my ability what I've called the four movements of concrescence, right? And this is where I think everything that's gone into formulating communal reverie comes into dialogue with what Ria Baeck is trying to describe as the circle of creation. I'm trying to understand the circle of creation through these paradigms, which is really, in the end, a dialogue between Gebser's idea of the integral consciousness and the mutation of consciousness, Corbin's idea of this kind of angelology, as he calls it, which is rooted in Sufi mysticism, and then Alfred North Whitehead's process philosophy. So Gebser talks about one feature of the integral consciousness entailing what he calls the transformation of the creative inceptual basis. This means a transformation in the basis upon which we experience and enact creativity. So there are four movements of concrescence. It begins with what I call rooting. So rooting entails, again, a holographic connection with the whole, that when we engage our subtle sensing, in some ways we are actually connecting, we take in the whole through prehension in a deep way. This corresponds to subtly sensing the vital nexus, right? Or the energetic interfusion with the whole that we are embedded in. That's been largely unconscious to us for a long time. And knowing from the body is a complex amplifier of cosmic prehensionality, as Matt Siegel says. Our body, when we sense into our prehending substratums, right, the centers of prehending sentience, out of which we're composed, we take in a deep knowing from the body that's connected to the whole. And I'm positing the group field as a second order amplifier, meaning when we connect to the group field, our ability to prehend is amplified and supported by the energetic intensification of the group field. This moves to opening. So opening to, again, utopic quasi-sensory imaginal space, basically just opening to the autonomous, or you can even say created / discovered presence of imagery, of mythic imagery, of mythopoetic images. But these are, so this is the mythopoetic dimension of imaginal attunement. And there's a symbolic and metaphorical elaboration of kairos. So it's to say that these images are revealing the kind of qualitative dimension of time, and that there's that what's being symbolically represented here are the contours of relevant potential in the present that the group is sensing into and making themselves available for. So imagery as a symbol of latent potential. And then this leads to inspiring. So this is connected to what Corbin would call the angelic function of the imaginal. Angelic, so it's connected with also what Whitehead calls lures of feeling. So relevant potential then is registered as a creative lure of eros. And eros comes online, there's a kind of desire that leads us onward. These images attract us. The potential that we can feel enlivens us. It attracts us. We feel called by it. And then there is a creative advance in participation with kairotic channels then. If these images are revealing the contours of relevant potential in the moment, we can answer that call and place our creative potential and agency in service of realizing that potential. And the archetype is conceived as a non-finite limiting factor, meaning mythopoetic constraint gives a kind of form to things, but it's not, the ways that can take shape is kind of infinite. We're participating in something that's archetypal, but not concrete. And when it's archetypal, it can be manifest in an innumerable number of ways. And this moment then is the sensing of what Benito Roy calls complex potential states. And I'll have more to say about that. Then it leads to incarnating. So this is leaping into sympoiesis, or co-creation, as Donna Haraway puts it. This is leaping into what Ria Baeck calls the circle of creation, where we're co-creating together. And there's a reconciliation of volition and surrender, as other we space practitioners have put it, meaning we open up to a deeper will to come through, and we place ourselves in service of that will, and our agency is part of it, but also being humble enough to sense into something that's wanting to come through and doesn't just come from our ego. So that's related to what Otto Scharmer calls open will. Right? And all of this taken together is the realization of what I've called the integral participatory imagination. Now, I think part of the task ahead is going to be, finding clearer, more accessible language to talk about all of this. I've been drawing on these specialized philosophical discourses to try to think through this stuff. And I'll be probably trying to find different ways of talking about it. But I also want to say, are there going to be changes in presencing practices looking forward? So one, leaping into circles of creation. Based on things I've witnessed particularly in the collective presencing community, I'm expecting there's maybe two intensities of these creative inceptual events. And the first is answering the call of source keepers. And this is what we've been seeing so far mostly. So here, an individual is visited by the call of creative inspiration, right? They intuit latent potential, and they call in a co-creative gathering in service of realizing this latent potential. Those who feel inspired by the call to participation then leap in, and they honor the creative potential that was inceptually sourced by that source keeper, committing to the ongoing unfoldment for as long as their own soul remains in alignment. So everyone is sovereign, right? But if they feel genuinely aligned with the creative potential that this source keeper, the person who first felt the creative inspiration, was tuned into, then they participate in it, and together that future potential is enacted. Then there's answering the call of the group soul. And I don't think we've gotten here yet. I think this is really what the circle of creation is trying to point toward. And I don't, it might be a real achievement getting there. And I'm holding this as a possibility. I don't know if it, something is calling me toward it, but I haven't seen it happen yet. So this is a human capacity, and this is Ria Baeck's writing, a human capacity that hasn't been possible before, because it integrates full individuality and authenticity with a collective calling and purpose. Ria talks about the group soul, like the potential is in something she's calling a group soul. Now, notably, both Sri Aurobindo and Gebser spoke about a group soul in their own way, in slightly different contexts. But so this would be realized by collectives who are capable of perpetually returning to the capacity for sourcing and living from relevant potential. And one thing I didn't mention yet is when it comes to the movement of incarnating, co-enacting potential, I spoke of this idea of agape as this transmutation and kind of like post-tragic maturation of eros, because when it comes to feeling future potential, it can provoke a lot of longing, and it does sometimes have like a transcendent longing quality to it. But the assumption here is that we're gonna, there are probably moments when we feel into this future potential and then we move to enacting it, and the real world is always going to be involved in it. Our human flawedness is going to be involved, the unpredictability of the world, the volatility of the world, like all of that's still going to be present, such that we're probably going to have our hearts broken over and over again. And what actually ends up happening is probably never going to be like a perfect, faithful, pristine kind of embodiment of like the archetypal potential that we feel. But the maturity is to still recommit to the world and be willing to love the world, even for its imperfection, even for its shadow, love and honor ourselves, even for our imperfection and our shadow, and recommit to loving the world such that we continually come back and commit to realizing these potentials. So there's a post-tragic kind of quality. We don't want to be too naive about this stuff. Like we have to mourn the gap between potential and actuality. Okay. Now, whoops. I want to read a bit from so one of these kind of answering the call of source keepers, right? When I participated in the Participation Mystique event that Cheryl Shu called in Berlin, as part of that, I hosted a Communal Reverie session, and Cheryl co-hosted it. And it got strange and intense in ways that I still don't understand, but I want to read one thing that came through in that session because I think it's relevant in what's coming here. And so I'll read it verbatim. This is going to be very hard to describe. It's like a field of these centers, and yet every center is a torus. But any number of the centers are held within an encompassing torus, and it is completely fractal. But the way it's positioned, any center is along the curve of any torus, so it's a field of centers, all on the curves of a countless number of nested, intersecting toruses. Now, there were no ideas involved when that came through, but I want to draw some from Benita Roy's paper on the theory of complex potential states here. She writes, the theory of complex potential states begins by imagining a field of potential. A theory of complex potential states begins by considering the potential state as an infinite array of dimensionless dots of infinitesimally small but non-zero capacity to connect with another dot. The array is infinite, so the potential is infinite. What actually exists is a small fragment of what potentially exists. Behind the actualized events, or what Whitehead would call occasions, lies a vast vibratory field which threatens transformation from one occasion to another. The process Gilbert-Simondon would call transduction. Whitehead would construe this threatening as a prehension, a feeling towards relationship that is both provocative and loving. Perhaps the space-time continuum is composed by the asymmetrical array that is always in flux, and vibrations become closer to connecting by increasing resonance. Incorporating the language of Whitehead and Christopher Alexander, it would also be correct to say that the field itself, the complex potential state, is composed by living centers, which are dynamic, animating, feeling monads, searching for relationships and stretching forward toward novelty. Unlike the logic of complex adaptive systems, which asks, what do we do now? The logic of complex potential states asks, what is possible from here? I want to quote Rilke, first. So there's a cosmology we're being invited to imagine here, right? It's a resonant field composed of sentient centers, connected through an ether of feeling, unfolding in mutually interwoven process, desirously seeking interconnections, participating in potential, co-creating worlds. And Rilke from the Sonnets to Orpheus, as translated by Edward Snow. Be, and know as well the terms of non-being, the infinite ground of your inmost vibration, so that this once you may wholly fulfill them. Okay, this was a long presentation. There's a lot to get through. So if you've made it this far, thank you for your attention. Thank you for witnessing. I hope in some small way, what's brought forward here is of service, and that some of these potentials can be realized when they're ripe. So thank you. Thank you.